Understanding the types of colors and how they work together can help you break your color selection process into chunks, making it more of a systematic process rather than a total guessing game. So setting a general direction as early as you can will keep you focused on your project and allow you to make additional color decisions a little bit more quickly and more easily. So for structural colors, I'm referring primarily to the background colors of your interface and the background color of any particular container or grouping of containers, as well as like borders and dividers, kind of like the things that are structural, that are kind of providing the structure of the app. The majority of interfaces tend to have like a white or a light gray background, and the inverse is often true for like dark mode enabled apps. But however, there might be situations that call for a very colorful background, depending on what you're designing for. But in most cases, if your structural colors are primarily restrained in saturation, like white, light gray, then your interactive buttons are going to be highly saturated and your interactive text will be highly saturated. Typically, you'll be on opposite ends of the spectrum with your structural colors and your interactive colors, but it's not like a hard, fast rule. Sometimes it all works together. So sometimes those structural colors might bleed into the interactivity, but it is also it's really good to start thinking about kind of segmenting and defining what colors are doing what things. And you're being very intentional about every little hex code that you use. Now, there might be a time when you have a fully desaturated color scheme for both structural elements and interactive elements. Like if you're using black as your primary call to action, maybe you're just doing a monochrome app, and that's totally fine. But in this case, there needs to be even more care given to the position and the color amount and the reversal of interactive elements. So it all kind of plays together. You can't just pick a color and run with it without kind of looking at the way negative space and background color plays together. And for interactive colors outside of structural colors, they're typically going to define, a type of action. Same way that we covered interactive text. Most of the time, your interactive text is going to have some type of color associated with it that's different than the rest of the interface. And sometimes it might have brand colors, so there's brand recognition associated with it. Other times it might just be a simple underline and the color blue, like your default hyperlink text. But overall, structural and interactive colors is just a kind of a first step in defining the color scheme for your website or your app. So a lot of times what I might do is set up like some tests with some structural background colors, see how those heavily saturated colors can play off of those background colors, and just run some quick experiments with just big color blocks before I go too deep into the weeds. But for this particular lesson, I want to kind of dive into several different personal projects that I've done that really explore structural and interactive colors and color choices on a case-by-case basis. So let's take a look at what we have here. So Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. Now, just zooming out, of course, I am using a similar avatar for a lot of these different social media apps. But for the most part, you can see the overall color scheme is just kind of white and light gray. A lot of apps, a lot of heavily used apps end up using white and light gray for their structural colors. It's just kind of lends the most opportunity to having, interactive elements, user-generated content, like specifically for like Pinterest and Instagram, it's going to be basically 99% user-generated content. So you've got photos, larger photos, background photos. All of those things are going to kind of become the UI. So there's not a lot of room to go crazy with like the Pinterest red. So they're using the red as an interactive color very sparingly, while their structural colors are very, basically white and light gray. If you look at Twitter's maybe the one example in this instance where they're using this kind of very cool light gray as like a background before the tweets load in. And it's very closely related to the blue. It's definitely like a lighter version of this color, just a lot more desaturated. So I've taken a similar approach with some of the newer apps that I've designed, especially when I know they're going to be very high utility, and there might be quite a bit of user-generated content. And most applications, there is going to be a fair amount of user-generated content. So we can use that information to help us decide how much color actually needs to be in place before we kind of get into it. And typically, the more utility-driven the app, most of the time, having a more neutral structural color is going to just lend itself to more scalability in the future. So for example, in this one, I knew I was going to have a bunch of different avatars in this kind of second phone line app. So we've got all these colorful avatars and the text messages and calls. So a lot of this ends up being, user generated content. So I didn't want, a bunch of heavily interactive colors, like heavy usage of interactive colors for things that I knew there was going to just be a lot of. So I'm just using a very simple white and dark gray kind of color scheme. In the primary calls to action in this app are this kind of dark color here, which is 2B, 2B, 2B. And when there are opportunities for very interactive looking text, I'm bringing in this kind of green color, which is definitely more of a brand color. You can see that I'm using kind of like a very, not fully saturated, teal, but I wanted to use this teal color that was as saturated as it could be, but it still actually passed the color accessibility contrast scores. And then this structural color that I'm using for the background of like the speech line bubble, this ends up being kind of in the same ballpark as this icon. If I click on this color and I go to HSL, you can see the hue right here is 182. And then if I go to the background of this color, it's very close to the same hue. So in the 180s, typically I'll choose one number for the hue, and then you can kind of use that at a very desaturated level for the structural color, and then a more saturated version of that for your interactive color. And you can kind of use those two extremes of saturation and lightness to kind of promote the structural definition of that color or the interactivity. So all in all, this is a very like monochrome app, and I'm using that 180 hue, either fully saturated or a lot desaturated, to kind of mean different things. And then if you look at this little thing, it's very, very subtle. Like if you have a missed call, there's a little bit of a kind of a saturated background right there. So if you look right here, I'm using that same 180 hue color, but I've pulled the saturation and the lightness way back. And it's not too dissimilar from this color, but you can see the saturation here is 20% and the lightness is 97. But right here, the saturation is 67%. So the saturation is kind of playing a big role in showing the difference between just a normal background and then a background that you need to pay a little bit more attention to. So same hue, similar lightness, but the saturation is jacked up between the two different colors to mean a slightly different thing. And this kind of usage falls a little bit into the structural and interactive, because this technically is a background color right here. But it's also, this entire module is tappable. So technically it is a structural and an interactive color. So we have to kind of be mindful of those situations when there's lots and lots of content. We might use some of the structural colors as our interactive colors as well, but we're not going to use that exact same color for like a primary call to action. In this case, we're using that 180 hue as our kind of our background, super subtle background, but then we've got this really dark color for our primary call to action. All right, so here's another example of a structural and interactive usage. These are actually wireframes that I created inside of Sketch for a responsive web app. This is kind of the smaller mobile version with the larger desktop version to the right of it. Now, whenever I'm doing wireframes like this, the structural color that I use is always going to be a white and a light gray, fully desaturated with no extra color. It's just a very simple way to get started right away without having to worry about color. And then I'm always going to use pretty much a similar a blue color here. You can see that this particular color is like 006DFF. Most of the time, if I'm ever doing wireframes, it's just, I'm not even worried about color because I know that using a light gray and a white is going to work well as the overall color theme. And using a primary color like this is going to work pretty well. And blue is one of the most commonly used interactive colors. So specifically for wireframes, it can be really helpful to start like this because you almost have the colors already kind of picked out for you. You just kind of pick, like, you know, we've got, for example, right in here, I've got 1 white, 2 for the background, 3 for this little image, and say 4 for this reversed out background to create a little bit more visual weight. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of structural colors, and then really just this one interactive color. So I'm using 5 colors overall for the entire app. And you might have a little bit of an exception. This might be a 6th sort of light gray color, but you can see I'm using this light gray background as a background for this interactive color. So I'm kind of pulling double duty with this color where it's kind of in the structural ballpark with some of these backgrounds, but it's also being used as a secondary interactive color. You know, if you want to get started and you're really trying to nail down the flow and the UX and things like that, sometimes it's just easier to design with grayscale and one interactive color. That way you don't have to think about it. And then once you can make other decisions about layout, and maybe you're playing around with typography and layout and you want to save color selection for later, this is a good way to kind of get started on all of that before, you know, just so you're not overwhelmed with too many choices, especially if you kind of want to flesh out that UX portion first. All right, so here is another app that I designed quite some time ago. This was for the initial version of the Roadie app, and I ended up with 2 kind of distinct color schemes. One was this kind of cool palette with this teal, and these colors in here were kind of derived from this teal color. So I've got a couple of different grays here, super light, light, medium, and cool. And then I've got this warmer palette, which is like this warm dark brown, and then this kind of warm gray, and this super dark like asphalt color. And then a couple of other special colors for like error messages and success colors. Now, a lot of these colors that I ended up, you know, you don't always pick out the swatches first and then design everything with the swatches. Sometimes you do, but other times you might design 5 of the screens and realize you're using certain colors for certain situations. Then you might abstract those colors out of those screens and start to decide on which ones are structural, which ones are interactive. Maybe you end up, you know, defining that after you've designed a few screens. So there's always this kind of loop between what you define up front and what you save for exploration, so you don't kind of paint yourself into a corner. So in this particular app, this was near the end of the project for kind of a handoff document. So I wanted to kind of explain the color choices here. So for a lot of the app, I'm using like a cool color scheme. So this is an example. This screen here would show like the example of a cool color scheme. I've got this cool gray. You know, it's not a desaturated gray. It has just a little tint of that kind of teal primary color just to give it a little bit more richness. And then even some of these grays right here, it has a little bit of that hue inside of it just so it doesn't look like a fully desaturated wireframe. For some of the sign up screens and some of the like interstitial kind of like action required screens, I ended up using like this dark version with this like these warmer colors. So the primary call to action color could work with the cool colors or the warm colors. So the interactive color worked across both screens, but I didn't want people mixing the warm structural colors of these big takeover screens with the cool grays of like the backgrounds and the dividers of the other screen. Now, this could have been overkill, and maybe it's easier to just pick one color scheme and go with it. But for whatever reason, for this particular project, it just felt like it makes sense to have this kind of duality kind of color thing going on. And again, here we're looking at, you know, this gray structural color, you know, this border, the white and the border and the background. I would consider all of those structural colors, whereas the green and the teal for Become a Verified Roadie, Become a Verified Sender, I would consider those as the interactive colors. However, this entire thing is tappable. So you could argue that the white and the gray is also interactive, even though it's structural. So the whole structural interactive thing is not so, like I said, it's not so rigidly one is one and one is the other and they can't mix. It just kind of helps you maybe just set a stage for, okay, this is kind of the background and the framing colors. And then these are the no doubt about it, saturated interactive colors. And, and again, it could be of black. Black could be your interactive color. So as long as you're contrasting the difference between the background and the foreground of that interactive color, then you'll be, in a good position. So in this particular app, this is kind of a sketch file filled with a lot of different kind of components for forms and activity feeds. But overall, and this screen might do it a little bit better. So you can see the primary call to action is this burgundy on the screen. And I'm using kind of a version of that burgundy for some of these icons. And so that's the primary color for that particular primary action. But then I've got this golden kind of brownish golden color for some of the secondary actions. And the burgundy and the golden kind of added this, they kind of work together to create this kind of warm color theme. Even the background here, it's not completely desaturated. So if you look at the background color for this particular app, you can see that it's got a 40% hue right here. So it's in this kind of like orangey ballpark, but it's been desaturated to 1, and then the brightness is at 96. So you can see that 1% of saturation gives it a little bit of warmth to just kind of go along with the color scheme. If I toggle back and forth between 0 and 1, it's probably hard to tell coming through on a screen recording. The 0% saturation, that sucks every bit of color out of it. It's just pure gray at that point. So a lot of times if you want to add just a little bit of kind of extra color into your structural color and just make it feel like it feels a little bit more cohesive, you can add that little tiny bit of saturation in either a complementing color where we've got this kind of burgundy and gold, or, I could have even gone with this burgundy and then changed it to 1% saturation and went up on the brightness to like 95. So that would still give it a little bit of a reddish tint, but that still felt a little bit cold. So I think the golden saturation works just a little bit better. And I could have gone to 2. That might have been a little bit better. It's one of those things that you just kind of keep experimenting with. You can see like in some of these other modules, I have this kind of like authenticated module. Well, because we're using this white background here for like a detail screen, I'm repurposing this background color here for the background of a module here. So I'm kind of reversing the structural and interactive, because this particular module would link you to your profile. So it kind of becomes interactive, but it's not a primary action. So it's just a way to use that same color in a slightly different context to mean something slightly different. So whereas if this is just a full width background color, then it's fully structural. But if it's used on a white background, it becomes like a very muted kind of interactive color to indicate that, hey, this entire thing is tappable. But we don't want to, we don't necessarily need that to be a huge primary call to action. And we don't even need it to be a big secondary, like golden kind of call to action. So we're using this almost as like a structural kind of tertiary call to action color. And all we're doing is just lifting the background color and using that as a background on white for that module. All right, so let's dig into this other app here. This one's called Steady. This was a couple of years ago. This was like a really clean kind of white background themed app. And there was a very specific purple used for this app and for kind of the branding. So you can see I've got this particular hex code. It's 254 is the hue, and then I've got 60 and 88 for saturation and brightness. But you can see that the 254 is not going to change even though I go to the secondary color. It's still 254, but I've brought the saturation down to 3 and the brightness is at 98. And that's just it's gonna give it that, like, it still looks like a purple gray versus if I were to create the same exact color and just take all of the saturation out, even if it was a little bit darker, it ends up almost looking muddy at that point. So if I create a quick little test and I'll place that symbol here. Actually, let's make this white so it's a little bit more easy to see. Just using the Sketch Runner plugin to quickly place these symbols. Hitting Command R to get the name, and then copying the name and pasting it into Sketch Runner. All right, so I'm gonna create a copy of that. And then let's just like kind of compare the difference between these two different colors. You can see this would still work. This background, this gray, I mean, it still looks like a pill, like a secondary call to action, but it's fully desaturated. It's not using any of the interactive color whatsoever. Whereas this one is saturated with 3% of the interactive color, which is this purple. To me, this just kind of, it looks a little bit more intentional. Whereas this one looks like not bad, but I don't know, something about the purple label and the fully desaturated background, it just seems slightly less refined. I don't know how else to describe it other than slightly less refined. And it doesn't mean that, you know, maybe you might have an app that is fully desaturated all over the place except for that purple color, and that might work better. You know, it's kind of up to your project. But for this particular project, there were other places like for input fields and other kind of main areas that I was using that purple lightly desaturated as like an interactive area. So these are kind of just subtle examples of when you can choose structural colors over interactive colors, or take an interactive color and pull the saturation all the way down to start to use that as a secondary call to action. And even you could use this probably for a background, like behind some white modules. You can see in some of these sign up screens, I'm using, let's see, let's go into this one and check out the background color. You can see in this one, I'm using a similar hue, but slightly less saturation for the input field. And then kind of this header has this, you know, really purple background. It's kind of mimicking the you know, kind of like heavily branded kind of sign up screen. And then once you're in the onboarding, I'm using almost the entire structure of the app is the interactive color, which at that point you have to almost create a new interactive color because the entire thing is, you're kind of engulfed in this onboarding experience. So for this particular one, I have these ever so slightly like opaque raised panels with a really, really thin little inner shadow, 1 pixel, and a really 1 pixel, really thin, kind of small 1 pixel shadow that just kind of raise these off to make them look like they can be pressed a little bit more easily. And then once you've selected it, I'm using this a darkened version of that as a secondary interactive color kind of inside this interactive structure for the selected version, just so it's really easy to tell. And then you hit next. And then, you know, so on and so forth. So in this example, I'm using the purple as the structure, and then I'm adding in another kind of slight interactivity color into that. But I wanted this kind of idea of like, okay, here's the branding, you hit next, and then once you go in, you're kind of like immersed into this next onboarding wizard. And then once you're finished, you kind of pop back out and you're on the home screen where we can kind of use this as a big call out. I'm still using that, you know, inside of this interactive world where purple is my background. I've got to use this dark call to action color because, you know, it just kind of creates that contrast that I need. Whereas on some of these detail screens, I'm using this dark area as the photo to kind of, you know, call out the detail of that actual thing. That's kind of similar to like an app store detail screen. And then on the white background, I can use that purple color again because my white is my structural color and purple is my interactive color. So it's just a very subtle distinction, you know, just to kind of contrast that with purple here being the structural color and the dark button being the interactive color. So it's just a very subtle kind of shift. And, you know, you don't have to necessarily pick one background color and one button color and use that forever and ever, amen, and nothing can ever change. You know, you can see in this example, I'm using the purple button, and then all of a sudden I'm transforming a very specific set of screens into that structural color, but I have to use a new interactive color. And then you can see even on some of these signed in screens, I'm using that same purple interactive color as the background structure, but I am bringing back in this very, not quite as dark, because it's not really a huge call to action. You know, I don't need it to be that dark. So this 20% opacity on this black, this ends up being like the secondary color for that particular screen. But then down here, you know, I've shifted again where I've got white background and I brought back in my primary interactive color. And then I'm back to using the white and light gray structural colors again. So just another example of kind of playing with that whole structural and interactive. Once you kind of define those two main pieces, you can kind of explore and kind of come up with some different solutions that you might not have had you not kind of understood that from a more of a foundational level. Okay, in this last example, I want to show you this website. There's just a couple of designs here for this website called BabySense, and I did a ton of wireframes for this project. So these were created after already had wireframes created for all of these pages. So I've already got the structure and the layout completed in the wireframe stage, and also basically all of the UX. And so now at this point, colors, typography, you know, some fine tuning of the layout, but just kind of sometimes it's going to help to separate those decisions when you can. Especially this particular project was a little bit more complex, so I wanted to separate out some of that UX in the very beginning. And since this was a baby site, I didn't want to go with the typical like pink and blue. It just seemed kind of very dated and old-fashioned. So I just kind of pulled these in as screenshots, because when I was explaining to the client my decisions, I wanted to also bring that up and say exactly what I just said. Didn't want to go with the pink and the blue because it did feel kind of dated. And so I think I pulled these off of Pinterest for some inspiration. You know, this kind of green giraffe. You know, this particular picture could be a girl's room or a boy's room, no problem. And not that there's anything wrong with a pink room for a boy's room, but the green and kind of these pastel color palettes and the brown maybe in this picture here, I was just kind of drawn to that. I thought that was a good kind of direction for the colors for this website. So I ended up, for this particular site, I did set up some colors. So first of all, I pulled these colors that I found online here, but just about every one of these fails the color accessibility contrast checker score, especially when you check it against white. So they could work for background colors or accent colors, but I needed something with a little bit more saturation. So I ended up using these colors, and I actually went ahead and named the variables. Sometimes I do that. Also, it's just kind of fun to name colors, especially baby colors. So we've got poop, stain, mint, blanket, wipe, and milk. And these were, you know, most of these were structural colors. And then these, you know, usually your darker color is going to be reserved for your text, and it might be read-only text, and it could end up being some kind of interactive text. But usually you'll have a darker color for your text, then you'll have some structural colors like I have over here, and then this is kind of like my primary and secondary interactive colors. So seeing this in action here, you can see that I've also used that primary color as kind of like the brand color. But because there wasn't a ton of color usage, and this is more of an exploratory kind of site, I feel like we could get away with using the brand color as the primary call to action and vice versa. So you can see right here, this is almost like a little avatar that's kind of bringing that color in as well. But you can see I'm using the wipe color here and the stain text color for the kind of placeholder input field colors. And then I'm using, let's bring this down a little bit more. I'm using this stain color as like the filters that you've added. So I'm looking for strollers, I'm looking for single strollers, and I want anything that's 70% off. And then I'm using the kind of primary colors as some toggles here to show whether it's list view or grid view. And then I'm also using this poop color here as a load more screen. And it's very, very likely that I tried using this color as the load more, but it kind of fell out of place. I think because there were a lot of these kind of pastel-y, light gray, like lightly saturated brown colors, it felt like this just seemed like it was like more at home with the structural colors, because you're loading more of all of these lists here. So it just seemed like the brown felt better. And then I'm using the green color again here, this primary color. The same one for like create your own list, And then using that color again for browsing by brand. So if you wanted to search for whatever, Baby Gap, you click on B and go there. And then we've got our dark color here, and you can see bringing back in that stain color with a bold size for terms and privacy down there. And then you kind of see how it plays out a little bit more on the larger screens. You can see that I'm just, and a lot of this is just experimenting with, okay, does the darker look better here or does the green look better here? And I'm just going back and forth. And then once I've made a decision on what I feel looks better and works better, then I'll start to say, okay, the green color is going to be used for this, this, and this, and these types of interactive elements. And the stain color and the poop color is going to be used for this, this, and this. Like, so for the filters and for loading more and for the text. And if I can't effectively define and describe how the structural colors are going to be used and how the interactive colors are going to be used, even if I have multiple interactive colors, if I can't define that, then I don't feel like I've done a very good job as a UI designer. I feel like you have to get it to a point to where you can abstract those choices and say, okay, here's the system. Here's what I've come up with as the system. That's going to work way better than trying to say, oh yeah, this green looks great. I think we should use this green. So if you're ever trying to present that to a client or a team, that just doesn't have a lot of weight behind it. So if you can, once you get to a certain point where you think it looks good, you can say, okay, this works because we're using this primary brand color in a very limited kind of way. And we're using it for these filters down here. We're using it for the avatar and creating your own list. A lot of these areas that manipulate the content and create more content, anytime you're kind of manipulating or creating, we're using the green color. Whereas if you're just loading in more of the same content, then we're going to use these kind of structural and secondary colors. So as you kind of choose your colors like that, you want to come up with a system. And of course, you're going to make it up. It's definitely created, but you're defining the colors and defining the system the same way that you would define the text sizes and the text colors. So you want to make sure that you just clearly get to a point once you've experimented, and experimenting without any definitions is totally fine and encouraged, but eventually you'll get to a point where you need to present it or at least document it or just have an internal idea of the way you're going to use that. Okay, for homework, pretty simple homework. I don't want to overload you with too much homework. So I went ahead and created a few of these examples. Now, these are not great color selections, but I just wanted to kind of create something that would jumpstart your ideas. Basically, we're going to create a structure with a background color and for the app and a module background color. And then we'll have an interactive color as our button. So we just have one interactive color, or if you want to go with two interactive colors, you could try a secondary version like as cancel. You could even do something like this. Maybe cancel is orange. Maybe you experiment with, bringing down that saturation down to 2 and the brightness is up. Or maybe since this is orange and it starts to get lost a little bit, maybe you take that to like 4 or 5 or 6. Don't worry too much about the number. Just move it around until it looks like it works. So maybe something like that works. And maybe you change your structural color for the background. Maybe, I don't know, play around with it. Play around with the light gray, play around with making it fully orange. Sometimes, just like in our, the steady example, you can have that big interactive color as the full background for certain examples. I don't know if you could do the entire app like that, but for certain kind of like immersive experiences, like a big modal alert dialogue that requires attention, this could work. You could use the same background color as a structural color, even though your interactive color is the exact same hex code. So just create like a little modal that has a title, some body copy, and a button, and play around with some different color combinations. I've started 5 or 6 here, playing around with some brown. And if you want to add a little bit more, go for it. But just start to think about structural colors versus interactive colors. And I think that separation of those ideas of those colors will really help you in all of your future interface designs.